The whole world got to know John Paul II, one of the most charismatic popes in the history of the Church. Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński, primate of Poland and spiritual leader of his friend Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, 19 years his junior, also deserves that recognition. Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński was the leader of the Church of Central and Eastern Europe that created the most effective strategy of resistance by the clergy and the faithful against the pressure of the communists. They not only defended the Church, but also made it the strongest institution in Poland, where the power of the Communist Party could not reach.
Catholic Church during the communist period in Poland performed a role similar to what it had done when there was no state of Poland between 1795 and 1918. The Church was the safe deposit box, the repository of national identity. It was the guardian of national culture. It was the guardian of national memory. And it was one of the institutions that kept alive the idea of a true Poland while communism was trying to rewrite the script of Polish history.
Cardinal Wyszyński paid an enormous price for his resistance. He spent over 3 years under house arrest. He was public enemy number 1 for the communists. Until his death, he was constantly under surveillance by a team of several dozen secret policemen. They were following literally his every step, depriving him of any privacy. Provocations and disinformation campaigns were conducted against him, sparing no methods, strength, and resources. Security operations against the Primate of Poland had the very significant codename, Prophet.
Cardinal Wyszyński knew he had a stronger position. The Polish Church was stronger than the Catholic Church in Hungary, stronger than the Catholic Church in Ukraine, stronger than the Catholic Church in Czechoslovakia. And he famously said, "We have demonstrated already during the Second World War, under the Soviets, under the Nazis, that we can be martyrs." He said, "We have proven that we can be martyrs. We are courageous. But the time now has come to live rather than to die. So how can we find a way to insist on our rights? How can we find a way to defend our culture and our faith, but without provoking more repression?" And this was the challenge, and it was a challenge that went on for 33 years.
The future Primate of Poland was born in 1901 in a small village, Zuzela. His father was Stanisław Wyszyński, organist and chancellor of the local parish, who was very much involved in his life. Stefan grew up in an atmosphere of devout Catholic piety, serving at Mass from childhood and participating in parish life at all levels. Marian devotion was of special importance in his home.
There were 2 pictures hanging over my bed at home, Our Lady of Częstochowa and Our Lady of Ostrobrama. And although at that time I was not inclined to prayer, always suffering on my knees, especially during the evening rosary, which was the custom of our house, yet after waking up, I would gaze for a long time at the Black Lady and the White Lady.
When Stefan was only 9 years old, his beloved mother died. Before she died, she asked him very seriously and solemnly to get dressed. It was clear to the whole family that she meant putting on a priestly habit. Orphan Stefan Wyszyński, as he mentioned many times later, moved part of his filial affection to another mother, the Mother of God.
Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński's bond with the Mother of God was such a true divine mystery. He recalls that he was born on the first Saturday of the month. His first childhood memory was of 2 pictures of the Mother of God, which hung above his bed, Our Lady of Ostrobrama and Our Lady of Częstochowa. He remembered very well his father kneeling in front of the picture of Our Lady of Częstochowa in the church in Zuzela.
Stefan's widowed father ensured that his firstborn child received the best possible education. However, Wyszyński, already as a teenager, was convinced of his true vocation. After graduating from the 4th year of junior high school, he started studying at the minor seminary and then at the major seminary in Włocławek. Even as a seminarian, Stefan Wyszyński visibly excelled. He did very well in his theological and philosophical studies. His talent as a journalist also attracted attention. Shortly after his ordination to the priesthood in 1924, he was appointed vicar in the Cathedral of Włocławek. The Blessed Virgin Mary played a crucial role in Wyszyński's very primacy.
When he felt very weak after his Mass of priestly ordination, with the Primate of Poland, he went to Jasna Góra. Our Lady has been such a huge divine help in his life.
We went to Jasna Góra for our first Mass and celebrated it there on the feast of Our Lady of the Snows on August 5, 1924. We went to Jasna Góra to have my mother stand by me at every Mass, just as she stood by Christ on Calvary. That is how our paths began. They led along the footsteps that Mary had trodden, going before me as light, star, life, sweetness, and hope, as a helper in a difficult situation, almost a nurse and a nourisher. After his ordination, in addition to his ministry as a priest, Wyszyński ran several Catholic periodicals, which were noted for the outstanding level of their content. He studied Catholic social doctrine, as presented in the encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was the Church's response to the most influential ideologies of the 20th century. To do this effectively, he studied the communist way of thinking.
The communist attempt to recreate the human condition, to create what they called Homo Sovieticus, Soviet man, was so contradictory to human nature that it was bound to fail in a country like Poland, where there was a true idea of the human person that was being taught, promoted, and lived by the Catholic Church. Stalin famously said that making Poland communist was like fitting a saddle on a cow. That doesn't work very well.
On September 1st, 1939, World War II began with the attack of the Third Reich on Poland. The fate of Poland, defending herself against the Germans, was sealed on September 17th, when she was traitorously attacked by the Soviets. The last soldiers of the Polish army surrendered on October 6, 1939. From that point on, Poland was under occupation. But Poles did not lay down their arms. They created the most substantial and powerful resistance movement in German-controlled Europe, while developing the structures of the Polish underground state. The Germans responded with terror and bloody repression. Underground warfare continued uninterrupted in occupied Polish territory. After the outbreak of World War II, Father Wyszyński hid from the Gestapo for several months. In 1942, he assumed the post of chaplain of the famous Institution for the Blind in Laski, while at the same time serving as chaplain of the Polish Resistance Home Army, the Campinos. The second act of the drama took place during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the liquidation of the so-called Jewish quarter. This area was razed to the ground. On August 1, 1944, the Warsaw Uprising began in the capital of occupied Poland. This was the largest military operation of a resistance movement in occupied Europe. The Home Army soldiers, poorly armed but with high morale, attacked German garrisons in Warsaw, then took total control over a part of the city for over 2 months. For 63 days, regular combat took place in Warsaw, comparable to the Battle of Stalingrad. During that struggle, Germans committed unimaginable mass crimes against civilians and insurgents. They killed over 200,000 people in Warsaw, men, women, and children. The Soviets, who were already on the city's outskirts, didn't support Warsaw's fighters on Stalin's direct order. Waiting until the city, the symbol of Polish independence and statehood, was bled to death. During the Warsaw Uprising, the Polish Resistance Home Army, the Campinos, served by Chaplain Wyszyński, took part in extremely heavy and bloody fighting. The chaplain accompanied them, bringing comfort and medical help, and, when necessary, also the last rites.
Running with a surplice and a stole to the place where the battle with German troops had just ended, we came across 3 wounded soldiers with their entrails torn out.
A few years after the war, he personally administered the sacrament of matrimony for the Home Army's liaison officer, whom he had carried in his arms for 4 kilometers to the hospital in Lasky.
During the Warsaw Uprising, he saw the Red Army come and stop. So he understood he had to know, how do they think? Now, I think as a Christian, he would try very hard not to hate. Jesus says in the gospel very clearly, love your enemies.
During that time, an event occurred that had a significant influence on the future cardinal's spiritual formation. From the burning capital city, the wind brought a cloud of half-burned pieces of paper. On one of them was a fragment of text with the words, "Thou shalt love." Wyszyński showed it to the nuns and said, "Nothing more precious could have been sent to us by the dying city. This is the most sacred appeal of the fighting Warsaw to us and the whole world. An appeal and a testament. Thou shalt love." In Lasky, there was a large field hospital of the underground Home Army. Badly injured insurgents were sent there from Warsaw. There were not enough doctors and nurses, so over time, the chaplain began to assist in surgeries. He made no secret that he almost fainted during the first one. However, the daily reality of the insurgents' hospital was dominantly painful and brutal. Young soldiers died at the hands of doctors and their chaplain. The insurgents' experience was fundamental to Stefan Wyszyński's later perception of humanity.
The long months of work in the insurgent hospital taught us a great deal. It was more than a university, because it was a deep understanding of your fellow man, something you generally would not learn from books. You acquire respect for a man not when you see him in a heroic position, but when you see a man in anguish. As we walk the streets of the capital today, let us remember that this is the city where more than 300,000 Varsovians died. The best youth washed the pavements of the city with their blood. This is the way of love. There is no love without sacrifice. Through such love, one gains the right to the homeland. That is why the youth were ready for anything. They were able to fight for freedom, and at the same time to protect themselves from hatred. On the Warsaw pavement of the destroyed city, turned into ashes and ruins, Christ remained. He was overthrown, powerless, lying on his cross, but with his hand pointing to heaven for the destroyed capital city, so that it would not stop believing that it could be reborn. Only one thing is needed: hope. Sursum corda, lift up your hearts.
Although Poland was Hitler's first wartime victim, and Polish soldiers fought relentlessly against the Germans on all fronts, the end of World War II marked the beginning of another occupation of Poland. Betrayed by its Western allies, the country was placed in the Soviet sphere of influence by the Yalta Agreement, signed by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. That meant that the future fate of Poland would depend solely on Stalin, and the governance of the country, against the will of the citizens and the public sentiment, would be taken over by communist activists trained in Moscow. Poland found itself in a new bondage, and the only institutional force able to resist the will of the authorities imposed on Poland by Stalin was the Catholic Church. The political situation after the Soviet troops entered Poland can be described as an anti-communist uprising. During the first 3 years of the Soviet occupation, the soldiers of the underground put up active resistance against the invaders. The unprecedented scale of repressions, mass arrests, and executions led to the gradual liquidation of the underground army. Although individual partisan units remained active for many years, armed resistance against the Soviet Empire lost its raison d'être. Immediately after the end of the war, Father Stefan Wyszyński continued his ministry where it had begun, in Włocławek. However, his talent and charisma were soon needed elsewhere, and higher up in the church's hierarchy. In 1946, Cardinal August Hlond, the Primate of Poland, ordained him at Jasna Góra as Bishop of Diocese of Lublin. At that moment, the barely 45-year-old Wyszyński became the youngest member of the Polish episcopate.
He was afraid to become a bishop. He thought he was unfit, although he was a professor. He preferred to talk to workers. He knew how to do it, and again, he put his faith in the Mother of God. He went to Jasna Góra for his episcopal consecration. He placed an image of Our Lady of Czestochowa in his episcopal crest.
In 1948, Pope Pius XII listened to the last will of the Primate of Poland, Cardinal August Hlond, and gave the most important position in the Polish Church's hierarchy to Stefan Wyszyński. From the moment of his appointment, on January 9, 1949, he became the leader of the Polish Church. And he assumed that dignity at the darkest hour in the entire history of Polish Catholicism.
The position of the Primate of Poland was almost unique throughout the Catholic world. But it took a certain kind of man to make that role come alive. And Cardinal Wyszyński lived the role of the Primate of Poland in a singularly impressive way, both as a symbol of resistance to communist usurpation of Poland's liberties, and as the man who, by creating the Great Novena, leading up to the millennium of Polish Christianity in 1966, effectively re-catechized the entire country.
He had to decide how to defend the rights of the church and the rights of the people without provoking a crisis.
In 1948, the communist dictatorship assumed a totalitarian dimension in Poland and began actions aimed at breaking up the strongest institution in Poland still free from communist influence, the Catholic Church. North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam are other countries where the communists have taken power in an extremely bloody way. The pattern is always the same: the physical liquidation of elites and ruthless war declared on religion. It was no different in Poland.
The primate managed the matters of the church in such a prudent way that the communists had to contend with him and his opinion.
The communists' goal was to gain complete control over the Church of Poland. According to their plan, it was to be completely subordinated to communist power. The main obstacle to achieving this was Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński. The communists knew that they had to break or destroy him. The first harassment from the communists fell on the new primate of Poland even before he assumed his position. Wyszyński was repeatedly harassed, stopped, and searched. It looked as if the security officers wanted to make it clear to the primate-to-be that from then on, they would follow his every step.
Cardinal Wyszyński had to be both faithful and clever. He had to be wise to figure out how he could find the maximum room for the church. And so he had to be courageous, and not just courageous for himself, courageous for all the Polish bishops together, and courageous for the whole nation, because they would follow his lead, which was a strong lead, but he had to be strong as a leader, and he did that.
Soon, the communists began an operation to build their own church, fully dependent on the authorities. They recruited about 1,000 so-called patriot priests for this purpose. Some of them were naive and loyal to the state. Others were regular agents of the secret police. The party intended to use them to seize power over the structures of the institutional church.
They would, every seminarian entering training for the priesthood had a secret intelligence service agent assigned to him. This guy followed him. He tried to read what the man was writing. They tried to bug, electronically surveil these people. This kept up after these men were ordained. There were obviously all sorts of attempts to compromise clergy, financially, sexually, otherwise. It was a rather relentless and very dirty business. This was not a gentleman's game. It was very nasty stuff, and it required a great deal of self-discipline on the part of church leaders to be able to resist this.
However, Primate Stefan Wyszyński tirelessly sought to define the relationship of church and state based on a bilateral agreement. In 1950, an agreement was successfully signed. Under the agreement, the communists provided the church with a minimum of freedom. Of course, they did not intend to abide by the agreement from the beginning. The fact that it was concluded at all only meant that the Communist Party did not yet feel strong enough to start an open war against the church. The year 1953 saw the launching of the terror machine against the church. Falsified trials against priests began. In January, Father Joseph Lelito was sentenced to death on trumped-up charges of espionage. The sentence was not carried out, but Father Lelito was tortured and brutally interrogated many times. Other priests were sentenced to long prison terms. This was something like an artillery barrage for what was yet to come.
Cardinal Wyszyński was a very shrewd, intelligent analyst of situations. But when the pressure became intolerable from the communists in 1953, Wyszyński read that situation accurately and said, okay, we're drawing the line here. We're saying we are simply not going to cooperate in any way with this regime, and he spent 3 years under house arrest.
In February 1953, the communists attacked the church with full force. The authorities announced a decree giving them the right to approve all church appointments and actions. Implementing it would mean that control over the church would be taken over by the Communist Party. In May, Primate Stefan Wyszyński handed Communist leader Bolesław Bierut the famous memorandum, Non Possumus, We Cannot. He announced there that any ecclesiastical appointments made by the Communist authorities would be completely invalid from the standpoint of canon law. Those possibly willing to take advantage of Communist promotion were threatened with outright excommunication. The letter was then publicly read during the Corpus Christi procession in Warsaw. We will follow the voice of our apostolic vocation and priestly conscience, walking with inner peace and awareness that we have not given the slightest reason for persecution, that suffering becomes our lot, not for anything else, but the cause of Christ and Christ's church. We must not sacrifice the things of God on the altar of the emperor. Non possumus. The communist response came quickly. On September 22, 1953, the Bishop of Kielce, Czesław Kaczmarek, was sentenced during a show trial. Before the sentence, he had been in prison for almost 3 years in the Security Ministry's prison. The indictment contained trumped-up charges of collaboration with the German occupiers, spying for the US and the Vatican, and attempts to overthrow the people's power. Only 3 days after Bishop Kaczmarek was sentenced, on September 25, 1953, Primate Stefan Wyszyński was imprisoned.
One of the gentlemen took off his overcoat, then removed a letter from his briefcase and opened it, and handed over a paper containing the government's decision of the day before. By this decision, I am to be removed from the city immediately. I will not be allowed to perform any activities connected with the positions I have held thus far. He asked me to acknowledge and sign it. I declared that I couldn't accept that because I couldn't see any legal grounds for the decision. I couldn't submit to this decision, and I wouldn't leave this house voluntarily. At the bottom of the letter, I wrote with a pen handed to me. I read and put my initials. The official insisted that I proceed to take my belongings. I answered, I am not taking anything. I came to this house poor, and I will leave poor. They brought me an overcoat and a hat. I took the breviary and the rosary. I went into the chapel to look for a moment at the tabernacle and our mother in the stained glass window. From the doorway, I looked once more at the picture of Our Lady of Jasna Góra hanging over the entrance to the Pope's Hall.
The communists did not dare to lock Wyszyński up in prison, but instead decided on internment. The primate was kept in closely guarded monasteries, being moved several times from place to place. In total, his internment lasted just over 3 years.
Under house arrest, not able to exercise, to communicate, and he used that time well, right? He used that time to think about what will I do when I'm released.
The interned primate was effectively cut off from the world. He tried to use the time spent in imprisonment as fruitfully as possible. He began to write the Jasna Góra vows of the Polish nation. Imposing on the primate 3 years of forced reflection and isolation did not pay off for the communists.
And 3 years is a long time to think about something. And in Poland, Polish Catholics have a great sense of their history, a great sense of anniversaries.
That during which he fought through the Great Novena and the celebration of the millennium of Polish Christianity in 1966.
While reading Poto by Sienkiewicz, I realized that it was necessary to think about that significant date. After all, I was imprisoned so close to the place where King Jan Kazimierz and Primate Leszczyński advised how to rescue Poland from the abyss. They both went to the southeast, to Lviv. The Highlanders paved the way for them, as beautifully described by Henryk Sienkiewicz. When we were transported along almost the same route from Prudnik to the southeast, to my fourth place of seclusion in the mountains, we traveled with the thought, there must be an act of renewed vows.
And Cardinal Wyszyński said, we have 10 years for the millennium of Poland's baptism. And he said, that's who Poland is. Poland is a Christian country, not a communist country. And 966 proves that. And on the millennium, we will renew it and we will show that this is not a communist country, even if it has a communist government.
Stefan Wyszyński won his first great victory over the communists from his prison cell. On August 26, 1956, about 1 million believers gathered at Jasna Góra. The text of the Jasna Góra vows sent by the imprisoned Stefan Wyszyński was read out to them. Although the pretext was the 300th anniversary of the Lviv vows of the Polish king Jan Kazimierz, the Polish believers received the act of unequivocally entrusting the country to the Virgin Mary, as an act of encouragement and faith at the turning point in history that started for Poland.
The initiatives he took were very ordinary, simple. The Jasna Góra vows simply concerned our moral, social, and family life, as if repeating the 10 Commandments.
In October 1956, the so-called de-Stalinization began in Poland. Władysław Gomułka, the new first secretary, took power over the Communist Party and the country. The party needed to improve public sentiment and its image. Political prisoners were released from prisons, and the propaganda machine promised changes for the better. The course towards the church also changed. Primate Stefan Wyszyński was released from internment. At the same time, other priests were released from prison. It did not mean, however, that the authorities suddenly decided to normalize their relations with the church. The entire security apparatus was directed against them. For the secret police, the security service, the church was the crucial target. They spied on priests and bishops in every possible way and conducted provocations and disinformation campaigns. They placed dozens of informers in Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński's entourage, who provided very detailed information about the primate. The reports included descriptions about how his writing utensils were arranged on his desk, what he ate, as well as precise information about his current state of health. The files included detailed floor plans of the rooms he stayed in, reports of his conversations with colleagues and visitors, and, eventually, meticulously typed transcripts of all his public appearances.
He came to embody the resistance of the church because he was so formidable, strong. In that situation, he believed you don't want somebody who's going to be jolly. You want somebody who's going to communicate strength. And when he's talking to 500,000 people at Częstochowa, doesn't make any difference whether there's radio or television, they're all seeing it. They're telling other people about it. And they're seeing a leader who is not going to bend, who will defend them all the way.
It's very difficult. How do you communicate with your people when the communist regime controls all the mechanisms? Cardinal Wyszyński had thousands and thousands and thousands of parishes, tens of thousands of priests, sisters. And this was a vast network, well organized. The word could come through the bishops, the priests, the people who were looking for the truth.
Immediately after his release from confinement, Primate Stefan Wyszyński began long and extensive preparations for the celebration of the most significant anniversary in the 20th century history of Poland, occurring 10 years later, namely, the millennium of the baptism of Poland and the creation of the Polish state. The millennium was to be a time of unification and spiritual renewal of the Polish Church, and the primate decided to ground its spiritual dimension on the exceptionally ingrained Marian devotion in Poland.
The Black Madonna, Our Lady of Częstochowa, had become over centuries a symbol of Poland, the nation. Wyszyński understood that. He had a very deep Marian piety himself.
In 1956, during the annual procession of the image of Our Lady of Częstochowa on the ramparts of Jasna Góra, the faithful gathered there began to exclaim, "Mother, come to us." The prior of the Jasna Góra monastery immediately wrote about it in a letter to Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński. The primate quickly found an answer to the requests of the devotees. Yes, the Mother of God could come to them. That is how the idea of pilgrimage of the Holy Image was born, that is, in visits to parishes in various dioceses throughout Poland. They set the plan of that journey for almost 10 years. It was to end during the millennial celebration, and it began in August 1957.
There would be hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. It was for 9 years, every week, every month, a way of showing that this was not a communist country.
The pilgrimage of the image of Our Lady of Częstochowa evokes strong emotions among the faithful and has become a great celebration for many years. The painting has a special meaning in Polish Catholicism. The monastery at Jasna Góra, its place of origin, is the destination of annual pilgrimages in August. Millions of people have traveled and continue to travel on foot from all over Poland only to stand at the feet of the Blessed Mother. But when Primate Stefan Wyszyński had the image travel around the country, something quite extraordinary happened. Now it was Mother Mary who journeyed to her faithful. That had a powerful symbolic meaning for them. The faithful drew encouragement and strength from the pilgrimage. In each successive parish, the appearance of the image attracted praying crowds.
The genius, the brilliance of sending the Black Madonna on pilgrimage around the country during the Jubilee celebrations in 1966. And then when the communists, in effect, arrest Our Lady and send her back to Częstochowa, he sends the empty frame around. This was a man who knew how to touch the hearts of his people, for whom this devotion was a great part of their national identity, as well as say to this really vicious regime, there's nothing you can do that can really stop us. We'll figure some way to be ourselves.
The tour of the painting of Our Lady of Częstochowa lasted for years, but the communists decided to end it in 1966. So-called arrests over the image began and happened several times. The communist police stopped the cars which transported the painting or those in which the primate or the bishops traveled. Once they forced the motorcade to take a different route. Another time, communist police tied up the painting with ropes on a truck. Primate Wyszyński described one such case.
We were stopped in an empty field in the village of Liksiana, 18 kilometers from Ostróda. There was a field nearby. There was a police car and a motorcycle. All the carts stopped. More and more communist police cars appeared. After an hour of futile talks, the action began. From Paslika's side, columns of motorized police on motorcycles, Mercedes police cars, and Sirena cars arrived. They formed a battle formation. The road to Ostróda was closed. People were gathering from far away. Strongmen from motorcycles walked in a Nazi step towards the van. They stood at a certain distance. The priests surrounded the cart with the painting, a moment of waiting. They demanded to open the carriage. The priests resisted. Some scoundrel from the militia forced his way into the car.
Eventually, the communists seized the painting in Warsaw. Firstly, it was interned in the Curia and displayed in a barred window. Then they transported it to Jasna Góra. The monks were forbidden to take it out of the monastery, and there were communist police checkpoints near Jasna Góra. This imprisonment of the painting lasted until 1972.
He said, fine, you keep the image, we'll send the frame. And then when the frame goes from parish to parish, the people not only gather, but then it's evidence how foolish are these communist regimes that they won't allow us even to have the image of Our Lady from Częstochowa. In those years, 56, 57, 8, 9, 60, on to 66, it became very clear that he knew better than the communist regime how to manage and inspire Polish society. That pilgrimage, that preparation for the great millennium of Polish Christianity, the baptism in 1966, of course, reawakened the idea that Poland was a free country under a communist regime. It was not a communist country.
The year 1965 was another turning point and another date in the 20th century history of Poland. On Wyszyński's initiative, a letter was sent from the Polish to the German bishops. "We forgive and ask for forgiveness" was published. It was an act of extraordinary courage, initiating Polish-German reconciliation 20 years after the end of the Bloody War, during which the Germans committed unimaginable crimes in Poland. The communists did not forgive the primate for publishing the letter. The first secretary of the Communist Party shouted in his speech about the chairman of the Polish episcopate being limited and deprived of national state-mindedness. The hysteria of the communists didn't help. The celebrations of the millennium of the baptism of Poland, preceded by the pilgrimage of the copy of the painting of Our Lady of Częstochowa, turned out to be a spiritual and symbolic victory of the Polish Church over the communists. The authorities never again dared to confront the Church with open force. But this didn't mean that the security stopped persecuting priests, bishops, and the primate. The courage of Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński and the firm stance of the Polish Church did not remain without influence on Polish society. Protests against the communist regime broke out regularly. 1956, 1968, 1970, 1976 were successive dates of bloodily repressed social revolts. Poles were still desperately looking for a way to freedom, and the foreign ideology imposed on them was maintained by tanks, which regularly took to the streets.
The communist war against the leadership of the Catholic Church in Poland was relentless. There was an entire department of the Służba Bezpieczeństwa that was dedicated to what was called disintegrating the Catholic Church. This was very serious business, and both Wojtyła and Wyszyński understood that they had to be very careful about how they dealt with their associates and how they dealt with each other. Now, neither one of them was afraid to say bold things in public, and did so, particularly Wojtyła here in Krakow during the Corpus Domini processions every year. But this was a real war.
From the end of the 1950s, the star of Karol Wojtyła, first Bishop of Krakow and later Archbishop and Cardinal, was shining more and more brightly in the Polish Church. Charismatic, expertly communicating with crowds and the media, open, resilient, and very young for a bishop, Karol Wojtyła was very different from the primate, while becoming equally popular among the faithful. These were ideal conditions for a peaceful rivalry between two natural leaders of one organization, but such a competition between them never took place.
Cardinal Wyszyński became a bishop at a very young age, 45. He became primate of Poland at the age of 47, 48. I think that made him open to an even younger bishop. Karol Wojtyła became a bishop at 38. He became Archbishop of Krakow at 43 years old. So I think he was open to this different kind of bishop, different kind of cardinal in Krakow.
Wyszyński came to understand Wojtyła was a much shrewder political actor, public figure, than he had imagined, that Wojtyła was not going to let a millimeter of distance appear between himself and Wyszyński, because that was the communist strategy, divide and conquer. And that publicly he would be totally supportive of the primate as the unique figure in the Polish Church for its relationship with the government. And Wyszyński came to appreciate that.
What united them above all was looking in the same direction, such total devotion to God, concern for man, for the Church, and finding this power that is Our Lady. The authorities tried to play a game between Cardinal Wyszyński and Cardinal Wojtyła and wanted to drive them apart. But there was a document in which they wrote, Wojtyła would never go into open battle with Wyszyński.
Communists tried to divide them by telling Cardinal Wyszyński he couldn't leave Poland. He was not usually given permission to travel, very rarely. And they'd give permission to Cardinal Wojtyła. He went to Australia, he went to Canada, he went to the United States, he traveled in Europe. The idea being, we'll try and, create tension. Cardinal Wojtyła would not permit that. Cardinal Wyszyński appreciated that loyalty of Cardinal Wojtyła.
In 1963, an unusual event took place, according to many, a miracle. The primate and Bishop Karol Wojtyła celebrated the coronation ceremony of the local statue of Our Lady in the sanctuary of Ludzimierz. During the ceremony, the royal scepter slipped out of the hands of the Virgin Mary. However, just before hitting the ground in front of everyone, no one but the young Bishop Wojtyła managed to catch it. "It looks like Our Lady wants to share power with you," Primate Wyszyński commented. After 15 years and the election of Karol Wojtyła as Pope, most Polish Catholics accepted those words to be at least prophetic. Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński quickly saw the Bishop of Krakow as the ideal candidate for his successor. On October 16, 1978, at the end of Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński's life, an event of great historical importance occurred, not only in ecclesiastical history. It turned out that Cardinal Karol Wojtyła would not be the next primate of Poland.
Habemus papam. Eminentissimum ac reverendissimum Dominum Carolum Sancte Romane Ecclesiae Cardinalem Wojtyła.
In the words he spoke after his election, "My beloved primate, let me only say what I think. This Polish Pope would not be on the See of Peter if it were not for you, if there had not been your faith, your hope, if there had not been Jasna Góra and this whole period of history related to your ministry."
Noi abbiamo in ogni caso la testimonianza pubblica.
We have the public testimony of St. John Paul II, a comment just addressed to the primate. He says that there would be no Polish Pope on the throne of Peter if there had been no primate.
Un papa polacco se non ci fosse stato il primate.
That is a very significant sentence.
Molto importante.
We know that none of us fully shares the view of the other person. Otherwise, there would be no dialogue, only overlapping words. Dialogue, a conversation, is born from the fact that there are differences between one person and another, which allow for their meeting. The fact that Wojtyła in gestures and words showed gratitude, respect, even reverence, speaks volumes as a testimony.
Questo dice molto anche come testimonianza.
Cardinal Karol Wojtyła's election as Pope was a watershed moment for the Polish Church and society. Although no one expected the outcome before the conclave, it immediately gave Poles in the Polish Church a powerful wave of new energy.
Cardinal Wojtyła learned from Cardinal Wyszyński. How do you resist when you don't have power? How do you instruct the people when you don't control the education system? How do you bring the people together when the regime wants to keep them apart? And so when he became Pope, when he started organizing pilgrimages, when he started bringing young people from all around the world together at World Youth Day, the world as a whole may have found it surprising. How did he think of this idea? He had learned it from Cardinal Wyszyński in the 1950s and 60s.
The first pilgrimage of the Holy Father to Poland was an incredible experience for the primate. The primate was simply pale because of that experience, pale from his concern that nothing would happen to the Pope, that he should endure this hardship, that no one would harm him. He just followed the Holy Father like a mother follows a child who is learning to walk, so that, heaven forbid, he wouldn't break his knee. It was such incredible human love and care.
Coś muszę powiedzieć do księdza prymasa. Nie ma. Niech żyje prymas! 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 Niech żyje prymas!
When Stefan Wyszyński began his mission as primate, the Polish Church stood on the precipice, and the communists were preparing to crush them. Now, nearly 30 years later, the Polish Church was more powerful than the Communist Party because she ruled over souls and consciences in Poland. It was the work of Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński. I think he was, shall we say, a priest of that particular historical moment. When I was young, we didn't know the names of other clergy or bishops in Poland. We knew the name of the primate. I was a young seminarian, but we didn't know about Wojtyła, an important figure. That only became clear after he was elected to the chair of St. Peter. Meanwhile, Wyszyński didn't need to be a pope to be known. He was known because he was loved. Because if they didn't love him, they wouldn't talk about him. This means that he was loved not only during his life.
On May 13th, the primate, who was already very ill, learned about an attempt on the life of the Holy Father. He shrank when he heard about it. He bent over and said, "I was always afraid of that." He went so courageously to the people. Three days before the primate's death, a phone call from Gemelli Clinic, the Holy Father called. And on this Polish side, you could hear only, "Father, Father, I am so weak. We are united by suffering. Bless me. I kiss your feet."
For over 3 decades, Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński led the Polish Church through the tremendously hard reality of Communist Poland. He managed to make the competition between faith and ideology for the hearts of Poles end in a humiliating defeat for the Communists. When Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński's successor took over as primate, no one in Poland believed in communist ideology. Only opportunists remained in the party and power structures. But the churches were bursting at the seams, and millions of fervently religious Poles went on annual pilgrimages to Jasna Góra, to Our Lady, so beloved by the primate. Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński died less than 3 years after the election of the Polish Pope in May 1981. He still lived to see the moment of the creation of the Solidarity movement, and Poles began their road to freedom, using both the energy given to them by John Paul II and the patterns and conditions built by their great primate. In 1980, Solidarity was founded, an independent trade union that at its peak had over 10 million members. And even though the communists decided to impose martial law in Poland on December 13, 1981, to once again suppress the rebellion with military force, the dominoes started to move. 8 years later, the countries of Eastern Europe threw off the yoke of communism. There would not have been the fall of the Berlin Wall without solidarity. There would not have been solidarity without John Paul II. There would not have been John Paul II without Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński. The process of elevating him to the altars, which began in the late 1990s, has already come to a fruition. The beatification of Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński took place in Warsaw on September 12, 2021.
Some people say, "I wish there were such a man now." Well, About Primate Wyszyński, the Holy Father said, God gives such a primate once in 1,000 years.